Is it possible that your inner child who is wounded is trying to find you on a more conscious level to help you in your suffering, including in your romantic life? That's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be diving deep into the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, which is sort of a dark fairy tale, right? And we're going to dive into that, and we're going to look at how this could illuminate some of the solutions that you might be searching for in your general life and also in your romantic life. If you're new here, my name's Michele Paiva. You are listening to the Muddy Path podcast. I would love for you to go to mymuddypath.com. When you get there, you're going to notice that I have some free resources, including a trauma trigger checklist. I have a free course for you called Happy Again to help you to get through your suffering. And I've got other podcasts and blog resources as well. So mymuddypath.com. Also, it is very helpful if you follow and rate this podcast. But first, let's go ahead and deep dive. I'm going to read you the story of short synopsis of Hansel and Gretel first. Get comfortable. A poor woodcutter and his wife had 2 children named Hansel and Gretel. Their mother died when they were young. Hansel and Gretel were very sad. Soon their father remarried, but their stepmother was very cruel. One day she took the children deep into the forest and left them there. Clever Hansel had some breadcrumbs in his pocket, and he dropped them on the way so that he could find the way back home. Alas, the birds ate all of the crumbs and they couldn't find the path that led back home. Hansel and Gretel went deeper and deeper into the forest. They were hungry and tired. Finally, after walking for a long time, they saw a cottage made of chocolate, candy, and cake. "Look, Hansel, a chocolate brick," shouted Gretel in delight, and she ate it hungrily, as did he. Now, a wicked witch lived there. When she saw Hansel and Gretel, she wanted to eat them. She grabbed the children and locked them in a cage. The witch decided to make a soup out of Hansel and Gretel and eat them. She began to boil a large pot of water for the soup. She was going to put Hansel in the pot first. She had Gretel in a cage. Gretel somehow crept out of her cage. She gave the wicked witch a mighty push from behind, and the witch fell into boiling water. The witch howled in pain and died instantly. Hansel and Gretel found treasure lying around the cottage. They carried it home with them. Their stepmother had died in the interim, and their father welcomed them back with tears of joy. They never went hungry again because they found the treasure. Okay, could that be any more morbid? But let's dive into it. First of all, a poor woodcutter and his wife have 2 children. The mother dies young. This could be symbolic of the mother hurts them or the father hurts them. It doesn't have to be a literal death. It could just mean that for Hansel and Gretel, their mother was dead to them. Or it could have been an actual loss where their mother, for some reason, wasn't available. Maybe she was working, or maybe she did actually pass away. So go back into your life. Did one of your parents have that dynamic with you? Now we're going to move on. Then the father soon remarried, but their stepmother was very cruel. Now let's deep dive again. Does this mean that the father became interested only in his work or became emotionally shut down? And it's not just the father. This could be in your life, the mother figure that became very shut down. Or did it feel like one of your parents replaced another parent with someone else and suddenly all of their focus was on that new person? You were not getting the love that you deserved. So already we see that in the first 2 lines of just a synopsis that it could be that as children, there might have been neglect, there might have been abuse, there could have been a lot of different dynamics happening. So we have this symbolic parent, the step-parent, who takes the children deep into the woods because she doesn't want them. Now, depending on which story you hear, sometimes it's the father that takes the children into the woods, but the bottom line is the children are brought somewhere from a parent, whether it's a step-parent or not, brought into a space where they are lost. So it's really just the idea of a guardian bringing this child, or a mentor bringing this child into a space that makes the child feel very lost. Think about in your life when you might have been cast aside or neglected or put in danger. What kind of coping strategies do you think that you might have had to create for yourself so that you could just survive and cope with the day to day and not feel completely unworthy or devalued? Now, the next part, we have Hansel, who is now grabbing breadcrumbs because that's all they have. They're really in a famine. That's what the story is all about. So they're in a famine. And okay, from a symbolic space, what is the famine? Is it really food, or is it love, right? Is it protection? So think about all of the different types of famine that you might have had as a child. And I'm not trying to make it overly dramatic. I mean, maybe you really didn't have much of any of this, but we can all understand that we've had some level of suffering. So I don't mean to make it overly dramatic, but let's just look at what types of hunger might you have had as a child. Was it attention, love? Was it caring from a particular person, or protection? So anyway, we have Hansel, who is now going and getting these crumbs and trying to figure out a way, because he knows he's overheard actually his parents talking, and he knows that he has to lay breadcrumbs down. So he is already freaking out, and he's going to put these breadcrumbs down, and he's not thinking clearly though, because he's stressed out, right? He's in trauma because he's overheard them. And so he doesn't count on the fact that all of these birds are going to eat the breadcrumbs. He's not going to be able to find his way back home for he and his sister. So think about, as you were aging, developing through your life, what kind of breadcrumbs did you put down that actually weren't going to help you? You thought they were, but they didn't. And there's nothing to be ashamed of with that. You know, life is a lot of trial and error. So what types of things did you do in the past that you thought, you know what, I don't regret it because everything made me who I am today, but if I did something a little different, that would have been better. So think about the different people maybe you even met and thought that you could trust, and they were maybe one of the breadcrumbs. So now we're going deeper into the forest, right? Hansel and Gretel are now lost, they're hungry, and they're tired, and they are just walking and walking. So symbolically, whether it's Hansel or Gretel, they are, as individuals, extremely vulnerable right now. So think in your life, when you had maybe some neglect or some suffering, how vulnerable that made you feel, and how you were just looking for a solution. And in the story, it is a cottage made of chocolate and candy and cake. So if you're in an actual famine, like in the story, where you are hungry for food, what is the one thing that is going to instantly give you some energy? And that would be something sugary, right? So it might not be the best thing for you, but it's going to solve the problem right away. We can also look at the witch as a narcissist who is love bombing and baiting. So we have this cottage made out of chocolate and candy and cake. And honestly, that would be anyone who's in front of you giving you your unmet needs. And that person in front of you isn't always a good person. So if you've had a lot of neglect and you felt cast aside, and suddenly a narcissistic person is in front of you and they're giving you lots of attention, you might feel like they really care about you. And there's going to be people in your life that give you attention and love you, and they do care about you, but not everyone is going to be a protective, beautiful soul in front of you, okay? So going forward, Hansel and Gretel decide they are thrilled at this, and they start just eating away at this cottage. And little do they know that a wicked witch lives there. So think about this also. If there's been a toxic person in your life as an adult, and sometimes that toxic person is us. So think about this. Okay, so what if we're doing all the right things? I'm going to turn it to us first. What if we think we're doing all the right things, right? But what we really have inside of us is someone who is naysaying and negative self-talk and feeling unworthy. We are our own witch. We are our own toxic person then. Or because we're feeling so low, we might be believing some of the people around us, or even lowering our standards and having people around us who are giving us a lot of negativity and do not want the best for us. They lure us in and they just really want to hurt us. Sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes they're in a really bad place and that's what's happening. So, okay, we have this witch who sees them and she grabs them and she wants to eat them. Now, symbolically, it just means maybe she wants their energy. So she can conjure up anything she wants. So why does she want them? Because they have something special that she cannot create on her own. With a toxic person, they may have all the bells and whistles of looking successful or looking compassionate. They may tell you that they're an empath. They may have everything that you think is on the surface a good person. But if inside they do not have that, they need to get it from you. So always think about what is the motivation of someone if it seems too good to be true. Now, sometimes if it seems too good to be true, it doesn't mean it's not. It just means you have to keep your radar up, especially if you had trauma or abuse or neglect, which all of that is traumatic. So anyway, this witch decides to make a soup out of both of them, but she's starting with Hansel. And Gretel is put in a cage. So as Hansel is freaking out and the water's starting to boil and he's thinking, what am I going to do? And he's in one cage. Then we have Gretel who's in another cage. But during all of this, you will notice that it is Hansel who is coming up with all the ideas, but the ideas are not working. But Gretel decides that she has a plan and somehow she gets out of the cage and she has the wherewithal to execute not only a plan, but execute the witch. Now, we have to take a look here at a little bit of the gender bias. Now, in the time that this was written, of course, there was going to be gender bias towards males being either controlled by a woman or hurt by a woman. And you may even feel that right now if you are listening and you've been hurt by a female in your life. I really feel for you if that is what you are going through. But the reality is that it can be male or female. We can look at it as, what does our society say? Our society says that men are the problem solvers, and our society often does not give women the credit for that. So here we have this plot twist of a little girl coming to the rescue. She pushes the witch into the boiling water, and this witch is screaming in pain and she just dies instantly. Now, if we look at symbolically how we are all like interconnected, okay, we're interconnected. So when we look at the cloud in the sky, we are part of that, right? Our exhale is moist, goes into the atmosphere, and together some of our exhales become part of that cloud, part of the atmosphere that we see. So the clouds that are going by could very well be exhales of people that you knew years ago, right? So if you want to just think symbolically of it. And so going into water is sort of like ashes to ashes, dust to dust, if you want to get biblical. But going into the water is sort of going back into that natural space. And her crying in pain, think of the witch as just a person that we need to have compassion for. She's crying in pain, but is it because she's in the boiling water, or is it because she can no longer control? And now she just dies instantly. We can look at this as a totally different story where maybe she doesn't die physically, but she is now overcome by these children who just want to live so much, so greatly, that she is aware that life is beautiful. Maybe she doesn't physically die. Maybe she just dies instantly as a bad person. And so now the children are in this cottage and they find treasures and they bring the treasures back to their father. And in the interim, the stepmother has passed away. So 2 times now we have 3 women in the story that have passed away. The original mother, then the witch, which we assume is a female, and then we have the stepmother who passes away. So why do you think in the story we have 3 different women that pass away, but we have one young girl who is actually saving everyone? And why is it that we are seeing the boy and the girl go back to this father who actually was trying to get rid of them and kill them? They were in a famine and he was looking out for number one. Why would we accept a story where these children are going back to an abusive, horrible relationship where they were in fear of their life and now there's tears of joy? So if we look at it symbolically, maybe they never were actually on an excursion at all. There was never any cottage, there was never a woodcutter, there was never anything. Maybe this is just the story of someone working through enlightenment, where they look at their life and there's lots of suffering, there is loss in their life, there's desire, there's hunger, there's trust issues, there are different elements of trying to find their way, not only as two siblings, but as individuals. There is a fear of how to deal with the trauma that they've experienced. They have crumbs of life. So what are the crumbs in life that you might be ignoring? What are the things that you set down that do not make sense? What are the things that you're ignoring in your life? So from a romantic perspective, I know that maybe you're in a struggling relationship, but are you ignoring the good in the relationship, the crumbs that are there that you don't want to see? And you're just pretending they don't exist. Birds came and took them away because you're unhappy about one or two or three areas of your relationship. It doesn't mean all of the relationship is bad. And I am not speaking of anyone who is in an abusive situation. If you're in a bad situation, of course you need to get out. But if you're just in a suffering romantic relationship, whether you're dating or whether you are in a marriage for many, many years, you might feel like those crumbs don't matter. So did you lay the crumbs for yourself that have steered you down a wrong path also? And do you feel regret and shame, but you're so regretful and have so much shame that you're just going to keep plugging away to make it work? Or can you just honor that, maybe I just need a different path? So I want you to think about a couple of things here. I want you to think about right now in your life, I want you to be conscious in planning and strategizing that you can move forward in your life by laying the right groundwork, the crumbs, okay? And there doesn't have to be aggression. And you can also see things as not what they appear to be. So like I said, maybe the witch is just symbolic of someone who needed to see that love exists and that life is beautiful. Maybe the idea that these three women have passed, maybe it's more of the nurturing, that you feel like you did not have nurturing that you needed. And that nurturing could come from a male or a female, but maybe the symbol here is just that you didn't get the protection and nurturing that you wanted. And maybe the fact that in the story that the father was first so neglectful, but then crying with tears of joy, maybe that's really just about you neglecting yourself and then feeling more enlightened and happy that you are basically fathering yourself and mothering yourself. So it's not just brute force that we get through life, because obviously that doesn't always work. It's strategizing, it's being conscious, it's recognizing what is in front of us and honoring that sometimes we might think that we're independent, right? Like the father was originally, when we first hear the story, we're thinking, okay, there's this father and he has two children and his wife passes away. So he's this independent man. But in the story, he's really getting his independence taken away by the stepwife, the stepmother, the wife and the stepmother. So he's really not so much, and I'm not making this about men or women, it's just a spouse or a partner being devalued because of the other person, allowing that other person to control them. And so later on, the children are having the same exact dynamic. The children are being basically downsized, right? They are being, their independence is being taken away because of the witch. So what could this tell us? It could tell us that patterns happen sometimes in our lives So what happened with your parents or your grandparents or people that were close to you in your life, if you don't look at those patterns and address them, they may happen to you. You may have the same type of situation that your parents or grandparents had that you don't want. Now, there's been a lot in your life that I'm sure you absolutely are thankful for, have gratitude for, and that you want to keep moving through generations or even just in your own life. But some of it, probably not. And part of that is because society changes, the way we look at the world changes, just the world in general is changing. So we have to make a consideration, that our landscape is changing. So if our landscape changes, our path is automatically going to change. So I want you just to think about that. And I want you to really deep dive into you, into your suffering, into your little breadcrumbs of life and the different paths that you've taken, and how you can find something about anything that happened to you that was negative. How can you, in your mind, find a way to make that something that creates resiliency in you and not a sense of weakness? And it's okay to be weak. It's okay to be vulnerable. But at some point, you're not going to be happy living your everyday like that. So there's trauma and there's post-trauma and the reactions and the coping strategies and the confusion and going down the wrong path and not having fulfilling relationships. And then there's healing. And there's being on the right path and feeling that you can see the suffering and address the suffering as in Zen, but also honor that suffering is temporary and that you can find peace and inner peace through loving yourself and others. So I just want to tell you really quickly, I have a beautiful program called Us for Couples, and it's an alternative to couples counseling. It's an alternative to premarital counseling. Very economical. It is the fee of one therapy appointment. And it's a 12-week program that brings you through a series of intimacy and conversation starters that are safe and not meant to ruffle feathers, not meant to dig so deep that there's conflict. It's meant to bring peace to the relationship, not conflict. 12-week program. And then after the 12-week program, you get 1 year of 52 weeks of prompts and date night ideas to nourish your relationship. I promise you it's not going to be like this where you're going through putting crumbs down and a fairy tale that sounds very morbid. So it's all very fun, but I just wanted to tell you about that. It's over on my site. It's called Us for Couples. And also go ahead over to my site. I have free resources for you just to work on yourself, even if you're single. And whether you're single, married, it doesn't even matter. Just work on yourself with the course Happy Again. And there's also a trauma trigger checklist, which I should have really brought up during the story, because a lot of times we have trauma triggers, which this story is littered with, and we don't always know them. And if we don't know them and recognize them, and we don't know what sets us off or makes us feel less resilient and vulnerable, we don't know how to address it to become more resilient. So we could talk about our trauma all day long for years, but until we start addressing the triggers, we might stay in the same space. So I hope that this podcast was helpful to you. Again, my name is Michele Paiva. You've been listening to The Muddy Path, and this has been a joy for me to share this story with you and the Zen infusion. I would love for you to rate this podcast and follow along. Thank you so much and have a beautiful day.